All right, we are live. The Supreme Court has been releasing huge decisions weekly for the past month. A few weeks ago, it was a big decision on guns, last week, abortion, and now, just this morning, the Supreme Court took a sledgehammer to the power of the EPA to regulate carbon dioxide emissions. Also, the left, in response, is having a collective meltdown. We're going to talk about this and more in episode 352 of the In the Tank podcast. Welcome to the In the Tank podcast. As always, I am your host, Donald Kendall, and we've got a full boat joining us today. As seemingly always, I have Jim Lakely, VP of the Heartland Institute, who was driving down the road on January 6th when out of nowhere, Donald Trump jumps on the hood of his car, headbutts a hole through the windshield before turning into liquid metal and oozing into the passenger seat, demanding to be taken to the Capitol. Jim, one, how are you doing? And two, are you willing to testify in front of Congress?
I am not willing to testify in front of Congress. They'll have to subpoena me and drag me out of my house to get to go there because they work for me. I don't work for them, by the way. But how could you not be in a good mood today? How could you not be in a good mood? Oh, happy day. The left is calling this the MAGA Supreme Court, and MAGA stands for Make America Great Again. And the Trump court, here he is. Trump.
Trump.
Fighting Trump. Yes.
Oh, sorry.
He
has made. I thought he was trying to hijack the podcast now.
Oh, my gosh. Yeah, there he goes. He's going to come in with his hands out. There he goes. No, I mean, it's a Make America. Yeah, it is a MAGA court. It's a Make America Great Again Trump Supreme Court. And the hits just keep on coming. And here's some bad news for the left. This is going to be Trump's MAGA court for at least another 2 to 3 decades. So we're just getting started, folks.
Oh, my goodness. Chris Talgo, senior editor at the Heartland Institute. How are you today? Good, sir.
Doing good. And I just wanted to echo Jim's sentiments that this is just the beginning, Donnie. We are going to have a long, glorious record of Supreme Court decisions that are actually based on the Constitution instead of based on the feelings and emotions of the Supreme Court justices. So I think this is, just glorious.
We're high energy today. This is a very interesting change of pace. Also joining us, Sam Karnick, Director of Publications at the Heartland Institute. Keep that energy level going. Oh, and he didn't unmute himself. I warned him not to do that. This is unbelievable.
That was just actually, I am a very happy fellow today, Donald. It's really delightful to see the consequences of the right trying to fight back and not just say, okay, we want to be loved by the New York Times. Never going to happen. Rather just win.
And a special guest for this episode because of the momentous occasion, we have Steve Milloy, a member of the Heartland Board of Directors and creator and publisher of junkscience.com. Steve, thank you for being on with us.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm very excited today, too. Supreme Court today did the right thing. And as someone who was in the room when this lawsuit was hatched, I'm very pleased to see it, although it's taken 7 years.
Oh, wow. 7 years. I was going to ask about how long this has taken to kind of work its way through the system here. 7 years is the answer. Before we get going, because we do have a lot to talk about today, I do want to put that message out there that I put at the beginning of every episode of the In the Tank podcast for mostly the audio-only listeners that are probably catching the show on a Friday. You could join us live, the video version of the show, on Thursdays at noon Central Time. We'll be streaming on Facebook and YouTube and Rumble and Twitter and pretty much anywhere else that will allow video streaming. So you can join in the conversation. You can put your comments and your questions in there. Maybe we'll show your comments on the screen. Maybe we'll address your questions on the fly. And lastly, We did create a separate channel for this podcast, the In the Tank podcast channel on YouTube, because after a couple of episodes where we're talking about COVID and YouTube threatened to destroy our main channel. So in an effort not to self-censor ourselves, we created a separate channel for the In the Tank podcast. So if you don't see the show coming up on the Heartland Institute one, it's because it's going to be too controversial, and we're going to have it specifically on there. So don't miss an episode, and make sure to subscribe to that separate channel. So like I said, we've got a lot to get into today, a lot of Supreme Court stuff. So let's get right into the main topic. Usually we start some opening chit chat, but if we have time, we'll save that for the end. So in a stunning change of pace, important news broke before our podcast. Usually big things happen right after we finish or on the Friday after. So, thankfully this one came right before it. So just one more thing to be appreciative of the Supreme Court. But seriously, just announced this morning, the Supreme Court ruled on the case of West Virginia versus the EPA. The decision effectively strips the EPA of the power to regulate CO2 emissions without congressional approval, prevents the EPA from unilaterally passing regulations that require a complete overhaul of the entire economy, and the decision, in the words of the literary and academic juggernaut Gizmodo, effed the planet. So, Jim, I want to get into the weeds a little bit of this topic in a little bit. So don't go too far in depth in this first question that I have for you. But I want to establish the magnitude of this decision. So, talking with you over the past couple of days, you suggested that this ruling would be bigger in terms of the ramifications than even some of the other rulings that we've seen in the past couple of weeks. Do you stand by these words?
I mostly stand by those words. And Steve Milloy is going to pour a little cold water on my excitement on this, as he's already done in the chat all morning. But look, I said that this could be a bigger decision and more important for liberty, and to restrict the power of the executive agencies to basically make up law as they go along and enforce it upon the public with no debate, with no statutes passed by Congress and signed by the president. And this West Virginia versus EPA case was one of those cases where West Virginia and coal companies and the state of North Dakota sued the Environmental Protection Agency, saying it just declared for itself, it took for itself the power to regulate carbon dioxide emissions out of power plants. And that was obviously crippling coal-fired power plants, natural gas for that matter, basically anything other than the unworkable solar and wind, and nuke is included in that as well. And so I was hoping for a decision in which the Supreme Court would say that, no, EPA, you're not allowed to just declare the ability to regulate carbon dioxide just because you state falsely that carbon dioxide is a pollutant, and under the Clean Air Act, we're allowed to regulate pollution. The EPA smashed that with a sledgehammer. They could have gone farther, but I still think, even in this, I guess what I would, after talking to Steve Milloy, what I would classify as maybe a 78% or an 87% victory on these issues, that's still plenty. And as we said at the top of the show, this Trump court is going to be able to revisit these issues for decades to come, and they just need another opportunity maybe to do it.
Well, so I want to we've got plenty of time here. So I kind of want to slowly walk through all of this stuff, because this is a little, when it gets to the Supreme Court rulings and this case and the precedents and all of that, it's a little out of my wheelhouse. If we want to talk about why, solar panels and wind turbines aren't great at collecting energy, I can talk all day, but this is a little bit out of my wheelhouse. So I want to kind of walk through it a little bit. So that's why I'm very glad to have Steve Milloy, who said he was in the room when that court case was originally hatched. So, Steve, let's start off with just some of the basic stuff. When did the EPA kind of take this responsibility to regulate CO2? How far does that date back?
Well, that dates back to about 2009. Actually, even further than that, the Clinton EPA had written a memo fantasizing about how it had authority to regulate greenhouse gases in 1998. It got some of its allies to petition EPA. Eventually, the petition wound up at the Supreme Court. In 2007, the EPA case held that EPA had the authority to regulate greenhouse gases. That was a 5-4 decision with Anthony Kennedy, supposedly a conservative, siding with the leftist judges. And so this happened right at the end of the Bush administration, and when the Obama administration took over, EPA hit the ground running. One of the first things they did was issue their so-called endangerment finding, claiming that CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions were destroying the planet. And they've been off to the races ever since. They've issued CO2 regulations to regulate fuel economy, but the ones that we're talking about now were aimed at coal plants. And as they had a much larger war on coal agenda. This clean power plan that was ruled illegal today was part of that. It was the last regulation in the war on coal that EPA issued, and it's the one that was supposed to cut emissions from coal plants by 30% by 2030. And the problem with all this is that Congress has never authorized EPA to regulate greenhouse gases. I have video of John Dingell, who is a co-author of the Clean Air Act, Democrat. He's deceased now, but he was a huge Democrat. And I've got a tape of him at a hearing saying that we purposely did not want EPA to regulate greenhouse gases, and we left it out of the Clean Air Act on purpose. And we never imagined that a Supreme Court, his word, would be so stupid as to allow EPA to regulate greenhouse gases. So that's how we got to where we are.
So, Sam, I know that there's the concept of kind of like mission creep when it comes to any of these agencies, these alphabet agencies. Was that just kind of like just kind of the natural effect of the EPA? Just, all right, we're regulating pollution. Now we're going to consider CO2 pollution. So we got to regulate that. Or is there something a little bit more kind of insidious kind of going on behind this, in your opinion?
There is something a bit more. What really happens there is that as you allow the agencies to do more, guess what? They do more, and then they do more, and then they do more. And this all comes from the court over the years deciding things based on the policy rather than the Constitution and the way the rules are set up. So what the court would say is, hey, this sounds like a really good policy. Let's have some of that. And it's not under the Constitution. There's no authority to do it. Well, what do you think the executive branch is going to do when that happens? And what do you think Congress is going to do when that happens? Congress is going to say, well, let's write up an ambiguous law, because if we write up the specifics, some people will get angry at us and they'll send money to the people who are running against us. And if we don't get very specific, if we just say, oh, just regulate, go ahead and do what you need to do, and the court goes along with it, well, you're going to get a bigger and thicker web of regulations across this land, as we now have.
So, Chris, when it comes to the EPA and the power that they wield, I mean, it seems like we're getting a little bit far from the actual protecting of the environment thing that I think was the original reasoning for the department. What are your thoughts of kind of the EPA pre this ruling?
I think the EPA has been out of control for decades, and I think this particular case is extremely significant because unlike the other cases that the court handed down earlier this week, they were very tailored to specific issues. And I think that this ruling sets the stage for the court to radically push back against the executive agencies run amok for decades now. EPA being just one example of many. And like Steve and Sam and Jim have already said, Congress has been derelict in its duty, I would say, for a very long time by passing these incredibly vague laws. And then saying, well, okay, now the executive agencies will have the powers to implement these laws. And that's not the way that our system was set up. Congress was supposed to make the tough decisions and the difficult calls. They were not supposed to pass super vague laws that they could then say, okay, we did our job. Now it's up to the executive agencies to actually enact these laws. So I think this is going to have ramifications, far and wide. And I think that it's, a great ruling if you are in favor of limited government and actually in favor of separation of powers and Congress actually doing its job. So I am just ecstatic.
Well, Jim, what is the, I know that we're talking about the EPA kind of grasping beyond their original kind of guidelines of what they were supposed to do, but what is the power of the EPA? Like, we talk about the different pieces of legislation that are being proposed, the Green New Deal, some new standards for vehicle emissions and that type of stuff. But like, what does the actual EPA do though?
Well, the EPA is actually one of the most, if you want to look at it in the most positive light, and I mentioned this on a couple other podcasts, the EPA has fulfilled its mission. It has, we have clean water, we have clean air. When it was enacted, when Richard Nixon created the EPA, I believe it was 1972, we had some serious problems in our streams and lakes and in our air and in our ground. And the EPA was established, and the Clean Air Act and other legislation passed by Congress to clean up our environment. The EPA was put in charge of making sure that was carried out, and they succeeded. But of course, no agency ever wants to go out of business. So they pretend that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are pollution and think that they can regulate them. But what's great about this decision, and I think I'm going to try to cheer Steve Milloy up. He's feeling a little under the weather, but he's so buoyed by this great news, even though he doesn't 100% like it as much as me, that he that he's on our podcast today. But this decision, it's pretty sweeping. This decision, by the way, was written by John Roberts, who is not really known for writing such sweeping decisions. He's always Mr. Half a loaf. I would, maybe a quarter of a loaf. He's always just trying to make a compromise with the administrative state and the left. The Obamacare decision, of course, is the most egregious example. But he wrote in his majority decision that capping carbon dioxide emissions at a level that will force a nationwide transition away from the use of coal to generate electricity may be a sensible solution to the crisis of the day. But it is not plausible that Congress gave EPA the authority to adopt on its own such a regulatory scheme. A decision of such magnitude and consequence rests with Congress itself, or an agency acting pursuant to a clear delegation from that representative body. The judgment of the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia is reversed, and the case is remanded for further proceedings consistent with this opinion. So basically, as Sam Karnick had mentioned earlier, this is a fantastic day for the rule of law and for a constitution that actually means something. That federal agencies cannot just declare on their own a problem that we need to solve, no matter how many people say they need to do it. Such things, major questions, as they say, need to be decided in Congress. A president has to sign a bill codifying that into law, and only then can a federal agency carry out that mission. So this may have, this didn't smash the Chevron doctrine, which we may not get into. But it did establish for right now, and this may have ramifications for the future, not just for the EPA, but for other federal agencies that want to declare for themselves the power to regulate our lives. And there was no more important test case than with the EPA, because if you can, they were basically going to shut down coal-fired power plants in this country, like they're doing all over in Europe. They're already shutting down right now because of the regulations of the Environmental Protection Agency. And the Supreme Court just told them you can't do that anymore. That is an enormous victory for the rule of law and a real neutering of the administrative state.
So, Steve, this is all based off of this West Virginia versus EPA case. What exactly did what caused that suit to be brought by the state of West Virginia?
Well, EPA under the Obama, Clean Power Plan, imagined itself that it had the authority to basically control the electricity grid in America by controlling what coal plant activity, on a general basis, not like within specific coal plants, but just issue regulations for all coal plants. And of course, Congress never authorized any of that activity. So today's decision basically acknowledged that reality, that EPA was never granted the authority to regulate all coal plants in America generally through the Clean Power Plan. And so, that part of this ruling is a tremendous victory. There's no question. I mean, you wonder why we even have to go through this, because everybody knows there was no congressional authorization for EPA to regulate coal plants, but somehow for the last 7 years, we've been under these bogus set of rules. I mean, there have been some bumps along the way with the Trump administration, but basically these rules have lasted now for 7 years. And it's just, why do we have to litigate this stuff? It's obvious.
So, Sam, question for you. I've heard it mentioned a few times now in the descriptions here, without direct congressional like dictate, right? That they're trying to regulate CO2 emissions. So I guess a simple question would be, can't Congress just specifically grant them permission to do this? What do you think?
Yes, they can, Donnie, and they didn't. And the Roberts writing in the decision made it very clear that they didn't do that, and that seems to have been Roberts's real objection here, and the thing on which he's pinning pretty much everything, which is that Congress could have done it. They have actually debated this in the past and said no thanks, and they didn't do it. So the fact is, Congress can do it. Congress is the place that should do it. What our Constitution really does is it gives each branch of government veto power over things, so that nothing bad would get done. Because if the Congress passes a bill that is not under its enumerated powers in the Constitution, meaning the powers that it's given explicitly in the Constitution, if Congress passes such a law, the president is there to veto it. He's supposed to. That's his job. He's not supposed to execute laws that are not constitutional. He takes an oath not to do that. And then if that fails, then the Supreme Court is there to say, no, you are not to enforce this law because it is not under the powers granted Congress in the Constitution. Now, there's a question of whether the states should have the right or do have the right to nullify laws. That has always been, the answer's always been no. But the reality is that what this was meant to do was say that if anything is going to be done on the national level, all three branches of government have to agree on it. If anyone doesn't agree, then it doesn't happen. So what this decision does do, I don't think it's as extensive as it's maybe characterized by some people. I don't think it's that extensive. I think Roberts was very careful to include his usual weasel words and things like that. However, it is extremely important in that it builds on top of the other decisions of this court in the past month, all of which move toward an acceptance of the notion that the Congress has lawmaking ability that is limited, and that it is up to the president and the court to ensure that Congress does not overstep its bounds. It is also up to the court to ensure that the president doesn't overstep his bounds, as we saw in this case, the executive branch being reined in. These are good things, but these are just the beginning. They're the start of the show. They're the overture.
Well, Chris, I mean, I would usually be interested to know like what the CNN and the MSNBCs of the world are reacting to this, and you're always the guy that watches those so that I don't have to. Now, granted, this decision just came down a couple of hours ago, so I don't suspect that you were on CNN watching the talking heads respond to this, but have you gleaned any type of reaction from the left as it relates to this, and the potential of them trying to just force through a piece of legislation that would specifically say that the EPA should be in charge of regulating CO2? Have you heard anything like that?
Well, I think one of the main reasons that Congress has not allowed the EPA to regulate CO2 is because you actually have to get 60 votes in the Senate to do that. And as we've seen, in many, many years, it's very difficult for the Senate to agree on much of anything, which is actually the way our government system was supposed to be. So now one of the things that I've noticed is we are seeing a new chorus from the left that we should just abandon the filibuster, or that we should abandon the filibuster for certain issues, whether those issues are climate change related or abortion related or gun rights related or election rights related. What they're saying now, and actually the President Biden, basically advocated for this, that the Senate should, circumvent the filibuster in these sorts of situations. So I wonder if this is going to, put that issue back in the spotlight here. But I still think that the American people are, behind the Supreme Court's, philosophy here that, hey, you know what? Congress makes laws. Hey, the Supreme Court should not just, invent rights, and also we should abide by the Constitution. So, I'm very excited for how this Supreme Court, as it's currently constructed, is going to, rule on these issues for the foreseeable future. And yes, I agree with Steve and I agree with Jim that this was not an all-encompassing ruling, but I think that it shows that the Supreme Court is on a different track than what we've seen, at least what I've seen throughout my lifetime, where it was always making rulings that were based on outcomes, and now it's based on philosophy, and it's based on principle, and it's based on what the text of the Constitution actually says. So I think
that's
yeah,
insane.
I know.
That's a new concept to me. I don't know.
Chris brings up an important point about the reaction to this and to the whole month's worth of decisions, which is that the left invariably questions the legitimacy of any organization or institution it doesn't have control over.
Oh, we'll get to that. We'll get to that, Sam.
Okay.
Don't you worry. We'll get to that. But Jim, take this opportunity as your time to do it. Any big victory lap you want to do in regards to this? Because I am going to go to Steve next about why it doesn't go far enough. So, I mean, this does seem huge. I mean, the CO2 regulation is like the cornerstone, the entire foundation of all the action that they're trying to do to pursue all this climate change nonsense. So have at it, Jim.
Yeah, well, I'll just say that, again, the language, not just of Robert's, majority opinion, but also the concurrence, especially by Gorsuch, is really good reading. So enjoy it's something you can enjoy all weekend, all the way through July 4th, Independence Day, because we actually are a little bit more like the country of our founders today than we were last month or even yesterday. But you know what? I never thought. I'm 51 years old. I never thought I'd live long enough to see a court like this. Not after Republican nominee, went native and, didn't rule as an originalist like they said they were going to, but instead decided to legislate from the bench. But, just this month, you don't get, you can't just invent, the court has said, you can't just invent a right to abortion and making each state ask the court's permission for any laws they have that may restrict it in any way. They decided that the right to bear arms means the right to bear arms in order to have them on your person outside of the home. That was the New York gun law case. And now we have this, where the Supreme Court is telling, it's basically putting every federal agency, the administrative state, which is all on the left. We all know that, it's called the deep state for a reason. This is the permanent bureaucracy that are dominated by leftists. And guess what? You're not allowed to just invent policy and law anymore, because, the declarations of these agencies have the force of law, which is why you see these lawsuits and that go all the way to Supreme Court to overturn what is essentially law as decreed by an unelected federal bureaucracy. And so now we have the Supreme Court putting all of these agencies on notice that you're just the days of doing that basically carte blanche with no checks at all on your power are over. And so this is just the beginning. And so I never thought I'd live to, frankly, I just never thought I'd live to see this. I never thought I'd live to see a Supreme Court, not just once or twice, but now like for 5 decisions in a row, actually get us back to a representative constitutional republic and not a society ruled by our elites.
So Steve, why
Donnie, just
go ahead.
I'm sorry, just real quick before Steve, gives the negative side of this.
I rants on our parade.
Yeah. Before he rants on our parade, I do want to just say one thing, that the left has been very good about incrementally pushing their agenda over the years. And I think that we are now starting to see the reverse of that, where now the right is actually incrementally pushing back against their agenda. And I'm not disappointed that they didn't just, completely, like overhaul, the EPA's decisions. But the fact that we're actually now pushing, in the right direction, to me is something to celebrate.
So, Steve, rain on the parade. Why is this in Jim's terminology only 80% of the way there and not 100% of the way
I
there?
don't really want to rain on the parade, and I love all the positivity. But the reality is, and it's really great that the court said today, yes, EPA can only do things that are authorized by Congress. Okay, everybody agrees on that. I don't even know why this is an issue at the Supreme Court, because it's axiomatic. It's just obviously true. But what the court did was they left hanging this 2007 decision, Massachusetts versus EPA, which allowed EPA to get into the global warming business to start with. Now, everyone agrees there's no part of the Clean Air Act that says EPA can regulate greenhouse gases. There's just no part of that. And I've got, John Dingell on tape saying that they never intended that to happen. Well, so Massachusetts v. EPA is this court-given right to EPA to regulate greenhouse gases. But, the Supreme Court is not Congress, and this decision says only Congress can authorize EPA to act. So EPA's got all these. So today's rule covers EPA regulation of coal plants. Fantastic. The EPA was never authorized to do that. But EPA and the Biden EPA has just issued new fuel economy standards based on greenhouse gas emissions, for example. And that was authorized through Massachusetts v. EPA, but not Congress. So, they could, what the court should have done today is go back to Massachusetts v. EPA and vaporize that decision and vaporize all EPA's ability to regulate greenhouse gases. And I'm surprised they didn't, because I'm pretty sure that, in the Dobbs case, I'm not sure that, I could be wrong, but I'm not sure that Mississippi asked the court to overturn Roe and Casey. It probably just asked the court to uphold its statute.
That's
but
right.
The court expressly overruled. I mean, it went out of its way and overruled Roe and Casey. Didn't have to do that. Could have just said, Mississippi, your cases, your law is solid. But in this case, it didn't go back to Massachusetts v. EPA, which is the Roe versus Wade of global warming when it comes to EPA. They just sort of narrowly ruled that, this particular EPA exercise of authority was not authorized by Congress, so therefore it's vanquished. But other EPA greenhouse gas regulations that are not authorized by Congress are out there hanging. Now, there's litigation before the court, or not before the Supreme Court, but in the courts about EPA's other authorities. So maybe they'll all be, swept aside as well. But I think that the court today missed an opportunity. As great as this ruling is, and it's a fantastic ruling, don't get me wrong. As great as this ruling is, it could have gone a little bit further and logically gone farther, not a reach. If Roe and Casey were gone, then Massachusetts v. EPA should have been vaporized as well.
Jim, I saw a comment that you left on Slack in regards to, I think it was Representative Ilhan Omar's claim that today's decision is going to open the floodgates, or I guess prevent this EPA from being able to regulate anything, like even if it's like toxic material and stuff like that. You said wrong or something like that.
Well, she tweeted, she says, this ruling not only flies in the face of the letter of the law, but of basic morality. The reasoning risks eliminating dozens of regulations that keep our water safe, protect us from heat and toxic chemicals. And I stated on our Slack thread saying, LOL, no, it doesn't. First of all, controlling CO2 does not mean you get to control the weather, as Steve Milloy has said on Twitter. And you must follow Junk Science on Twitter. It's one of the best Twitter accounts out there. But yeah, you could eliminate CO2 emissions from the United States right now. Boom, just like that. If you could do it by magic, it wouldn't affect the weather in 100 years anyway. So it doesn't matter. But the idea that this ruling will disallow the EPA to protect us from heat is just it's hilarious. But it's also, as Steve was just pointing out, in the larger scheme of things, it is a rather narrow ruling. Guess what? The EPA does get to regulate toxic chemicals. They do get to keep our water safe. That's their mandate. That's their mission. They get to do that. They just don't get to treat carbon dioxide coming out of power plants as a pollutant, because it isn't. And as I'm sure Steve and others on this podcast can tell you, yes, 50 years ago, 40 years ago, even 30 years ago, the actual pollution coming out of our coal-fired power plants was greater than it is today. That was the EPA's doing. They made sure that we got better scrubbers on those exhaust smokestacks. They're not smokestacks, and CO2 is coming out, but it has to emit something. It has to emit because we're burning coal to turn generators, so there's going to be an emission from that. But EPA helped us clean that up. The actual pollution coming out of these power plants is so small compared to it was just a couple of decades ago. But carbon dioxide, again, is not a pollutant, so you don't get to regulate it. So, the idea that this completely, kneecaps EPA is wrong. It does kneecap its extreme overreach and declaration of, its own power. Yeah, and that's a good thing. And if Congress wants to do that, if Congress wants to regulate carbon dioxide emissions at our power plants, they are welcome to vote on a bill that would do that. And in fact, every time a so-called cap and trade system comes up for a vote in Congress, it fails, even when Democrats have pretty solid majorities. Why? Because it would ultimately cripple the economy. So the left has been able to lean on and depend on radical leftists who populate the EPA to carry out their agenda, an agenda that was never voted on, an agenda that was never passed, an agenda that is against the will of the American people as expressed through our representative republic. Those days are that's why I'm a little bit more optimistic about this maybe than Steve is. I mean, I think there will be other opportunities to get to Massachusetts via EPA, but this basically lays down the marker that no, the left, you don't get to just go to the deep state and have them implement your policies anymore. You got to actually earn them the hard way. You have to get laws passed.
Jim's filibustering.
I'm sorry.
AOC's comment is emblematic of the response to court decisions since FDR 85 years ago. So for the past 85 years, anytime the court was making a decision, people would go into the run-up of that decision saying, wah, 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 if you do this, this will happen, boo-hoo. And the court generally said, oh, okay, you can have your way. You get to rule, you get to decide, even though it's just entirely unconstitutional. What happened in the month of June 2022 was unique in that the court said, it was like Larry Bird when one of his players was complaining when he was president of the Indiana Pacers. He says, he don't get to decide things around here. And that's what the court said this month. Now, they didn't decide 100% great on everything, but boy, they decided, and that is good in itself.
Chris, I want to come to you next. So I don't know if you've seen this, but in the dissenting opinion written by Justice Kagan, she argued, quote, that members of Congress often don't know enough to regulate sensibly on an issue. So basically, she's saying that the EPA knows more about this stuff, so they should be allowed to do whatever they deem necessary. I mean, that seems like a pretty frightening precedent to set, if she did get her way. It's like, nah, elected officials are too dumb to govern. We'll just let the administrative state doing it. Am I building a straw man argument here, or is this essentially what Kagan is saying? What do you think?
No, I think that is so symbolic of their mentality that we should just trust the experts. And I think that the experts have done a horrible job of imparting their expertise over agencies for a very long time. I think that Congress, obviously they're not experts on every single item that they legislate. However, they are supposed to use common sense, and they're supposed to look at the Constitution as the guiding light for what the government is and is not supposed to do. And I think over the past 100 years or so, ever since the progressive era really came into being, we have forgotten the fact that Congress is supposed to make the laws, and Congress is supposed to pass the laws, and the Supreme Court is supposed to rule on the constitutionality of those laws. And we have gotten into this bad habit of allowing Congress to pass, very vague laws, and then allowing these executive agencies to come in and say, don't worry, we'll take care of this. Just trust us, trust us, trust us. And they have not, been trustworthy. And I think the American people are sick and tired of that. I think this really is, symbolic of the Donald Trump election in 2016, where he, was running against the deep state, and he was running against the swamp, and he was running against, an out of control EPA and out of control SEC and so on and so forth. And I think that the American people are just flat out sick and tired of this. And they are not going to buy into the fear mongering that people like Ilhan Omar, AOC, Maxine Waters, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris are trying to inflict upon them by saying, oh my gosh, the Supreme Court is, taking away your rights. And oh my gosh, the Supreme Court is, going to allow climate change, to become an existential threat. I strongly believe that the American people see through that. And I think that this is going to be the norm for the foreseeable future. And I'm very, very glad about that.
Yeah, I don't get Justice Kagan's remarks there. Like, couldn't experts from the EPA just send some of their people to go talk to lawmakers and say, hey, you need to allow us to do this? And if the lawmakers agree, they can, I don't know, pass a law. Like, it just seems like a pretty simple system that we got going here. The idea, like, well, the legislators got too much on their plate. We can't bog them down with important stuff. We'll just allow agencies to run wild. Like, it just seems like a really silly thing to argue in favor of.
Why is it that the EPA is more knowledgeable than the market and human beings? I don't buy it at all. What happened here was that she was actually alluding to the great Friedrich Hayek and the knowledge problem, where he said that socialism doesn't work because the government can't have sufficient knowledge to make the decisions that the market can through the price mechanism. Hayek was, of course, right. So Kagan says, well, Congress doesn't have sufficient knowledge, so we'll give it to another branch of government, one that is completely inaccessible, that nobody can have any effect on.
Right.
Again, the court just said, hey, you don't get to decide things around here.
And one other thing is the bureaucrats at the EPA, they don't have to answer to anybody, but Congress does, and that's the way our system was supposed to be set up, so that the people every 2 years in the House and every 6 years in the Senate and every 4 years in the executive branch could say, hey, we agree with this, or hey, we don't agree with this. But the fact that Congress has basically said, okay, fine, we'll just put the responsibility on the executive agencies, it allows them to not take responsibility for the actions which they should take responsibility for.
Yeah, I want to get into the left's kind of response to this in terms of the Supreme Court, but I am curious about just like, what is their next step forward when it comes to all of their climate change agenda stuff that they've been trying to push? Steve, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be a repeat of the Obama administration. Obama was frustrated in 2009 and 2010 with cap and trade. So he went to EPA, and EPA launched its war on coal. And, the regulations that actually crippled the coal industry were the PM 2.5 related regulations, cross-state air pollution rule, and the mercury air transport standard, neither of which had anything to do with greenhouse gases. And so that's what Obama's going to do, Biden's going to do now. And we actually have a lawsuit in federal court right now aiming to stop that. But I wanted to say just two things about, as far as, what Kagan said about EPA and Congress. EPA's got a whole division of congressional relations. They send people up to the Hill all the time. I mean, the problem is that EPA doesn't know what it's talking about, and the people on the Hill don't know. So, I mean, that's just, it's a hopeless process. But the second thing, and one thing we haven't mentioned, and I think this is the most important part of all this, there are tens of thousands of coal miners, their families, their communities, investors, states who have all been severely harmed by what EPA did. And what EPA did, the Supreme Court today said was illegal. Okay, so here we have billions and billions and billions of dollars and societal harm, personal harm, medical problems caused by illegal federal agency action. Where do these people go to recoup their losses? How do we address that? I mean, this was not, good faith behavior on the part of EPA. Everybody knew EPA did not have legislative authority. It was just wrong, and these people have been harmed, and they've been screwed.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Yeah, I don't know what will. Go ahead, Jim. I don't know what will result about that. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's a fantastic point, Steve. And also, again, go to follow at Junk Science on Twitter, because Steve's been, despite his his illness, not feeling good today, is still tweeting like crazy when he has the energy. And you had a tweet about an hour ago, Steve, where it said it was a Washington Post story, and you said EPA to ignore SCOTUS decision.
Yeah.
EPA spokesman Abdullah Hassan says, "quote Our lawyers will study the ruling carefully, and we will find ways to move forward under federal law." And then you comment, "There's no federal law allowing EPA to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. That's today's holding." And I'd responded to you on Twitter. So continued lawfare it is then, except this time the eco left is finally on defense. And I think that's, I think that's extremely profound because I wrote it. But I think that's one of the great things about this decision and all the decisions by the Supreme Court is that conservatives, people on the right, constitutionalists have been on the defensive in, at the Supreme Court and elsewhere for decades. And now on this EPA thing and on guns now and on lots of decisions, because this court has decided to be the originalist court that we thought we would have for the last couple of decades with so many Republican presidents. It's now the environmental left, the eco left nut jobs who are going to be on the defense in a lot of these court cases, because this is establishing just in the EPA law that you don't have the authority to regulate like that anymore. So now they are on the defensive posture from a legal perspective, much more so than they've ever really experienced, I think, in the last 30 years. Am I wrong on that, Steve?
Yeah, let me just, earlier someone said that, we're locked into this Roberts court or the Trump court, for decades to come. I just want to point out that, they arrested someone trying to kill Kavanaugh. Clarence Thomas is, I understand he's in good health, but he's still up there. Alito is up there as well. These guys, you never know what's going to happen. This fall, we have an election, and hopefully Republicans will take over Congress. And I don't mean to, I'm not crapping on anybody's 501c3 by saying this, but it's just reality. Republicans may take over Congress, but they may not take over the Senate. I mean, that's going to be a close race. That's going to be close. Just there's going to be a handful of states, and we still not have resolved the issues from 2020. And if the Senate goes or remains Democrat, and conservative justices start to fall off the court for whatever reason, then it's not the Trump court for the next 30 years. So, it's important to get this stuff right and get it right the first time, because you don't know what the future holds.
Yeah, I am curious about what's going to happen with the Supreme Court now. Usually they say like, oh yeah, it was a 1-2 punch. Well, in this case, it was a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 punch because it's just been one thing after another. It was enough to make, most conservatives happy for one issue or another, but it's certainly enough to make the left go into a collective meltdown, which is what we've been seeing over the past couple of weeks here. Maxine Waters and others defying the decisions of the Supreme Court, Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot and others blasting Justice Clarence Thomas, as you just mentioned there too, Steve, using very foul language, I might add. And AOC and many, many others suggesting the idea of packing the Supreme Court and how that should be considered. So, Chris, I know you've seen a lot of anti-SCOTUS rhetoric lately. Are there any other big names that I missed of people that are kind of trying to lay waste, saying that it's discredited, et cetera, et cetera?
Oh, geez. I mean, it's literally across the board. It's, all the talking heads on CNN, all the political pundits on MSNBC, ABC, NBC, CBS. I mean, the way that they talked about the everything from the gun decision to the abortion decision to, even the EPA decision, they're, acting like it's, the apocalypse is upon us. But Donnie, one of the differences is that when the Supreme Court a few years ago ruled that gay marriage was now just going to be legalized across the country, I vividly remember that there was a woman in Kentucky who was responsible for granting marriage, like licenses or, what have you. She said, strictly based on my religious, beliefs, I, don't want to do this. She was prosecuted for that.
Right.
So I just wonder if the left is going to say, hey, wait a second. a few years ago when the Supreme Court was deciding things in the way that we liked, we said, hey, you must abide by it. However, when the shoe's on the other foot and the Supreme Court is, ruling the way that we don't like it, well, now we can just say, we can ignore the Supreme Court. So it's total hypocrisy.
Well, the left will definitely be, held up to the same standard as the right. I mean, that was
happens all the time.
Well, it's ends justify the means.
That's the joke of the episode, folks.
Ends justify the means. And Donnie, you're right. There are already a lot of calls for expanding the court. Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, all of them. So, I doubt that it's going to happen, even though Biden is saying that he's open to it now. But it just goes to show how desperate they are, how frustrated they are with the fact that they don't have complete control over all three branches of government the way that they want to.
Yeah,
I would say that the left is not engaging in hypocrisy by their own lights. They are all about results. So whatever happens, we just got to get our results. So they're always right. There's no hypocrisy there. They're just doing what it takes to get the results. The right could learn from that.
Yeah, the game is called I Win. And
you lose.
You lose, right. AOC was on the late night show with Stephen Colbert, which is just painfully unfunny, where she gave a very muddled and factually incorrect history lesson about the Supreme Court. And she also talked about the three branches of government, the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, and how they're co-equals and how they're supposed to keep others in check when, one branch is overstepping its authority. And then she says that the Supreme Court was overstepping its authority with some of these recent decisions. And she said that it delegitimized itself. And I'm just thinking, well, maybe it's like a checks and balances type of thing. Congress and the executive branch could, I don't know, pass a law. I just don't understand the disconnect of why this doesn't get driven home with these, liberal types like AOC. And I would play the clip of her talking here because she did say, and I quote, I believe that President Biden should entertain expansion of the Supreme Court. She said this on, national TV. Like I said, I would play the clip, but one, YouTube would probably hit us with a copyright strike and take our video down. And two, no one really wants to hear her talk anyways. So just take my paraphrasing for the sake of not having to play her. So granted, the context of her saying this was that it should be like a threat, intending to make the court not go as far in terms of overstepping their authority. But there are many, many others, many influential people, many people in positions of power that don't think it should be a threat and that Biden should, in fact, pack the court. So, Jim, let's go with you. How terrible of an idea would this be?
Oh, it'd be a terrible idea. In fact, before we came on the air for this podcast, Sam and I were discussing that very thing, that the idea, the threat to pack the court. It's like, oh, okay. Well, you want to put 4 more Supreme Court justices on the court, Joe Biden? Fine. Next time a Republican president comes into power, he'll put 15 more on. We'll end up with a Supreme Court with, 127. Maybe they'll even outnumber the House of Representatives at that rate. It's like, a lot of people could play that game. I don't think this is not George H.W. Bush's Republican Party anymore. I said it at the beginning that the left seems to think that putting the word MAGA or ultra MAGA in front of everything is an insult, or that makes people angry, or people don't like that. Again, MAGA stands for Make America Great Again. This is a MAGA Republican Party. This is a MAGA right-wing, conservative movement in this country now. And they're going to play for keeps now, too. After 30 years of defeats on almost every level, they now know the new rules of the game, and they're going to play by them. So I think this threat is actually pretty, it's empty. But I don't think Biden is going to do that. I don't think actually he has enough Democrats in Congress who would approve any of these. I could see Manchin, for one, after this great victory for his home state of West Virginia, deciding not to actually vote with the Democrats to put another justice on the Supreme Court, even just one, let alone another 5 or 6 or whatever fantasy the left has on this kind of deal. But look, the left, we talked about this. Andy had this tweet up a second ago where AOC said, catastrophic, a filibuster carve out is not enough. We need to reform or do away with the whole thing for the sake of the planet. Now, because she's not that bright, it's hard to determine whether when she says do away with the whole thing, she means the Supreme Court or she means the Senate. Who knows, because she's not that bright. But either one, this is the way the left operates. again, we talk about this on this pod all the time, and you just mentioned it, Donnie. It's like, gosh, learn how to take the L, guys. You don't always get your way. Sometimes you have to actually fight for your principles, and you have to fight and keep fighting and actually get actual laws passed and stuff. People on the right have known how to deal with an L for our entire lives. And that's why
that's why we're losers, Jim.
Yeah, well,
that's why we've been losers.
That's why days like today are so sweet. That's why it's so much sweeter today.
One of the first Trump campaign promises was that we're going to win so much that we're going to get sick of winning. And I'm starting to get sick of it, folks. I'm starting to get, this is usually have a dour tone on this podcast, and Jim's ranting because of, not out of excitement, out of anger and righteous anger most of the time. So yeah, Trump was right. Just took a few more years than we thought it would. Sam, what would it actually take for them to expand the Supreme Court? I don't suspect this would need some type of constitutional amendment or anything. Would it just be an act of Congress?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And Congress has the authority. The other thing that Congress can do is they can take things out of the hands of the Supreme Court. They could have done it on Roe v. Wade since 1972, and they never did it. So that ought to help you understand what the likelihood of Congress acting on this is. I think the fact that Joe Manchin is from West Virginia, and this last case was brought by West Virginia, should tell you a lot. It's hard to get things through there. Well, that's good. We shouldn't have the federal government doing everything. We shouldn't have the federal government with their hands in everybody's business all the time. And that's how our system was made to be, so that the various powers, the various branches of government would veto one another's bad ideas. And that's what's happened here. Now, the problem we have today is that we've had almost a century of living in the opposite world, in the bizarro world, in which the government could do everything. So now we have to sweep away these things. How do you do that? It's like, as Steve said, you bring lawsuits. You also have to get power in Congress, and you also have to get the executive branch. You have to get the Supreme Court, as we've done, and then you have to act. You can't just sit around and say, okay, we want to be loved by the New York Times. They don't want this. We're not having it. No, you have to say, I don't care. I'm going to do what's right. I'm going to do what is responsive to the oath I took when I took office. When people start doing that, then we will roll back all of these awful things that have happened for a full century, and they're awful because they were wrong to do. You don't have the right to do it. They're as AOC says, but it's for the planet. Mm-hmm. Well, too bad. You don't get to decide things around here.
Right. I think Thanos did his Thanos snap for the sake of the planet, too. Steve, last question I want to ask all of you. I'll go with you first, though, is just predictions in regards to the Supreme Court stuff. Like, is there actually going to be a push to expand the Supreme Court, or is this just, a week of dealing with people like AOC, waving their fist at the clouds? What do you think is going to actually happen?
Well, it depends on what happens with the Supreme Court. If the court maintains its current makeup, these people are going to continually be unhappy and continually, agitate for changing the court and changing our system. I mean, they want system change, not climate change, system change. And, it would behoove us all to take them at their word. I mean, they've been working on this for 100 years. These people are not liberals or just leftists or socialists. These people are communists. They've been capturing our institutions now for 100 years. They have not captured the Supreme Court. They had it for a while, but they don't have it now. And we have too many politicians that just don't get it. They think that these things are actually legitimate disagreements, and they're not. This is part of a long-term plan. It's called progressivism, which is a code name for communism, to take over our country and control our lives. And all you got to do is to just I'm not raving. I mean, that is the reality. Look at everything they want to do.
Sure.
You find me something that is increasing personal freedom. Just one thing. There's nothing.
Right. Jim, same question to you. I mean, I could see, and if I want to be pessimistic about this, I could see a kind of a young liberal alternative to Biden running for president in a couple of years, that this is like their main policy platform. We got to expand the Supreme Court to make it more representative of the nation. What do you think?
Not going to happen. There's 9 Supreme Court justices now. There will be 9 Supreme Court justices 2 years from now. There will be 9 Supreme Court justices 10 years from now. And what I actually would like to see is now that we basically have a little bit of wind at our back, and by us and by our, I mean constitutionalists, people who believe in limited government and that not giving, basically unlimited power to an unelected bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. Now's the time to go on offense. Now's the time to go on. If it's going to be lawfare, let's have it. Let's have some more cases to put in front of the Supreme Court that expand our liberty and decrease the size and power of government. I'd love to see 10 decisions like this every single year, and maybe we'll get it if we get enough lawsuits out there.
All right. And Chris, I'll let you have the last word on this because we are pretty much out of time. Do you concur with the seeming consensus that this is all just a bunch of angry AOCs shouting at the clouds and we're not going to actually see an expansion of the court?
I do, because the Biden administration has been such a complete and utter disaster. I cannot foresee the American people electing a Senate that's made up of 60 Democrats, which is once again what you would need to pass a law to pack the Supreme Court. Okay. I just cannot see that happening in the near or medium term future. I think we're safe.
No, you're right. This would be a totally a change of pace if the Biden administration was able to do anything.
But Donnie, can I add one quick caveat to that? Real quick.
Okay.
I would not put it past them to invent another pandemic and then have us, vote by mail and all those shenanigans again. So you never know.
Now our podcast just got destroyed and our channel is ruined and everything like that. All right. Thank you all for tuning into this episode of the In the Tank podcast. Please join our show every Thursday if you want the live show. Every Thursday at noon Central Time. You can join the conversation, put your comments and questions in the live chat there. Maybe we'll show your comments on the screen or address your questions on the fly. If you would like, you can follow us on Twitter at InTheTankPod. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for the show, feel free to email us at inthetankpodcast@gmail.com. Jim Lakely, where can the fine people find you?
At J Lakely on Twitter, at Heartland Inst on Twitter, and always visit heartland.org.
Sam Karnick, where can people go to see your work?
Thanks, Donnie. At ST Karnick on Twitter and all those other realms, and heartlanddailynews.com.
Fantastic. Chris, what do you have to pitch today?
StoppingSocialism.com, and just want to say happy Independence Day to all of our listeners and viewers. July 4th, 1776 was a monumental day.
Right.
It should be celebrated.
That's right. It's Independence Day, not 4th of July. Steve Milloy, where can people go to see your work?
Okay, you can get me at junkscience.com and on Twitter at junkscience.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you all for tuning in. We will talk to you next week.